Thanks so much for joining. Welcome to Lord Vaizey, Ed Vaizey. Thank you for coming with those lovely flags behind you. Where are you then, Ed, today?
I'm in a works canteen.
Fantastic. And I take it those flags are for the Euros, for the football.
Correct.
Fantastic. So today we're launching the Fix the Digital Divide for Good manifesto for a future government. I'm sure there's lots of manifestos out there. Welcome, everyone. I'm Helen Milner. I'm the Group Chief Exec at Good Things Foundation. And Ed and I have known each other probably for a very long time because, Ed, you once sat in the chair at the department for, I think it was only called Culture, Media and Sport back then, wasn't it?
Correct.
So
That's right. Yeah, I was the minister there.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And so the you were responsible for libraries, but did you also have responsibility for other things relevant to digital inclusion?
Yeah, well, I was basically the tech minister, so I covered the whole gamut of digital inclusion. We did online safety, which was then in its infancy, so that was obviously a very relevant piece there, and looked after the tech sector, which was more about the kind of investment. So yeah, I had a lot to do with digital inclusion, and I now work with a US not-for-profit called Common Sense Media, which has a digital curriculum in schools, teaching kids how to navigate an increasingly complex digital environment. So it's still an area I'm very involved in.
Yeah, that's great. And I also remember that you used to do quite a bit around making sure that people with disabilities also had access to the internet. I remember that was you set up a task force or something around that as well.
Yeah, well, I felt very strongly that tech was an opportunity actually for many people with disabilities. People forget that a lot of the tech that is built, if I could put it this way, for the able-bodied to be make life easier, like asking Siri, is actually fantastically useful, obviously, for people with disabilities. And uh, quite a lot of the tech actually is adaptable in that way and can actually transform the lives of people with disabilities. But obviously, there needs to be opportunities for people to understand how to use the tech most effectively in their lives. And I felt very strongly across the piece in terms, because I was also the telecoms minister, that there should be, every service should be as inclusive as possible. So, for example, with BT, we worked on sign language videos for people calling call centers and that kind of thing, so that they could actually have a face-to-face conversation with somebody using sign language. And again, that's enabled by the fact that all our phones now have video in a way they didn't 10 or 20 years ago. So all of this kind of comes together to make digital, actually, we talk about digital exclusion, but also digital is a fantastic tool to include people and give them access to services that they wouldn't have been able to access very easily before this technology was so widely available.
Absolutely. And I think that it's interesting what you're saying there about the sign language videos is that it's strange thinking about technology because we had all that technology, 10, 15 years ago. And then we had the innovation, but really the pandemic saw a massive acceleration of digitization, but also saw for many people it brought a digital exclusion really into the spotlight with people understanding there were so many people who were cut off from those essential services and from one another.
Yeah, well, it's very true that particularly with kids, for example, and particularly kids in low-income families, as a typically middle class person, I take for granted that my kids will have access to technology, they'll be able to have a laptop or whatever, and also they'll live in a house where they have room to study on their own if they want to, and have their own private space. But obviously, the pandemic brought home that for many families that wasn't the case. Sometimes families with 3, 4 kids having to share their technology if they were lucky enough even to have one laptop, living in cramped accommodations, so finding it difficult to find the space to study is particularly important. I mean, obviously, we all became the Zoom generation overnight, and again, in many ways, technology has transformed the way people can live their lives, but it's a very middle class transformation in the sense of I can work from home and use Zoom. I can order food deliveries using an app and so on and so forth. Uh, but it is essential for people who need access, particularly to government services, whether it's benefits or whatever, that they also understand how they can use technology to access those services, and it's made as easy as possible. And then, although I wasn't directly responsible for government digital services, for example, that's another good example of where the more we can digitize government services, make them intuitive, easy to use, the more we can potentially really transform people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two sides to this, isn't there? Is making the services easy to use, intuitive. I mean, you mentioned Siri, voice activated, etc. And then on the other hand, making sure we get people to so that they can have the devices, they can have the connectivity that they can afford, and also that they've got the skills and confidence to use them. So there's like those two sides of it for government. So we have actually shifted the digital divide over the years, luckily. So I think when you were minister, I think there was around 12.5 million people who were excluded. Now there's 8.5 million people who lack those very basic digital skills. That there's 2.5 million, about 2.5 million households who can't afford the internet. And unfortunately, that number's gone up because of the cost of living crisis. So people are actually who had it before are switching it off. And we did some work with Liverpool University that showed that there's actually 3.7 families who are below the minimum digital living standard. So actually, and this is a standard that's been the researchers have established in co-designing it with families about what that minimum is. So this is making a huge impact on people's lives. So Ed, why don't I get to the chase and shall we launch the manifesto? Is that a good idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I should just say, though, that your last comment reminded me, obviously, that one of the issues about digital inclusion is cost, which I hadn't mentioned at all when talking to you about it again, which kind of belies my comfortable middle class existence. Is the cost of tech is huge, whether it's a laptop or a smartphone, but it's also the cost of the digital service. Do you have access to broadband, which is something we worked very hard to do to get broadband to as many parts of the country as possible. But then what is the cost of your mobile phone contract? What is the cost of your broadband? And I'm pleased to say that, and I still think it's the case, that broadly speaking, on average, we are pretty competitive, if not very competitive, with our European counterparts in terms of particularly with, the lots of mobile virtual network operators. You can get, £5, £10 a month contracts, which are pretty usable. And also broadband itself is quite competitive, but the cost of digital is a very important factor.
Absolutely. And I agree that from my knowledge, we do have one of the most competitive markets in the world for broadband and for mobile, but there are still millions of people who can't afford it. So that's both about, that market competition, that there's definitely efforts being made by the businesses, by the telecoms businesses, but that we still have people who have very little money when it comes to the end of the week, and therefore affording services, even at those cheap prices or social tariff prices, is really beyond them.
And of course, Jeremy Corbyn promised free broadband for all.
He did. And do you think that was a good idea or not such a good idea?
It's a good idea, but whether it's affordable in terms of the priorities that the government has to spend money on is another question.
I think that's right. I think the I think at the time that I very much felt like it was a step too far. But now I actually think if you could, a bit like, a universal credit, as it were, if you could actually determine who can't afford it and then make it provided for free, then if you can actually work out which providers have got cables in the ground, cables in the air running down my street, and who on my street can't afford it, then actually there must be a way in a sophisticated society that we can make sure that everybody gets it. At least we can make sure that all new homes and all private rented homes had broadband installed as a basic, in the same way as we do have with electricity when we move in. So, that would actually be a massive step forward.
Yeah, that's something I fought for when I was the minister. I was told it would hold up house building, but of course, house building hasn't progressed at the pace we want it to progress. So that's very frustrating. And that seems to be a very easy win to make sure that all new housing estates were broadband to the home. And it
Absolutely.
is true that broadband is now a utility like electricity, gas, and water. And there are ways that you can have social tariffs for those utilities uh, through the welfare system and working with those utilities and the regulator. So it's worth keeping an open mind about this, about how you make broadband affordable to the poorest in our society, so that they can have access to digital services.
Yeah. I 100% agree with that, Ed. Right, let's go through our manifesto. So, Good Things Foundation, we're laying out our manifesto for the next government, the future government, whatever that government will be, and we're asking for sustained, joined-up leadership, and we're asking them to commit to a clear plan of action, and building on the work that some of your noble peers in the House of Lords, some of your colleagues there, the great report that they did on digital inclusion that Baroness Thal led last year, which was an excellent report and very clear and full of the evidence of the need for concerted leadership and action on digital inclusion. So there are five asks in our manifesto. The first one is really, I think, about leadership and about partnership. So it's about saying that the government should collaborate with businesses, civil society, and the public sector to fix the digital divide. We know that the economic case is there, so the business case is there. If we fix the digital divide, we would bring £13.7 billion back into the economy. And we know for every £1 spent on that investment, we would get almost £10 back to the economy. So it absolutely is a social justice issue. It's absolutely about an equality issue, but it's also an economic issue. So this is very much about collaborating with businesses, civil society and the public sector. And we're calling on government, but also businesses to co-invest in this strong plan to fix the digital divide. So Ed, I'm going to pause when I say each one of these so you can comment. Good idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the key point about the internet is that no one governs the internet, although the Online Safety Act, to a certain extent, has given Ofcom the power to regulate platforms. It's always been the case. Even the protocols that make the internet work have been a combination of business, civic society, and government. So it is very much in the DNA of how we do digital in this country, and in fact, in many countries around the world, that there is always a collaboration between civic society, business, and government. It's not just a mandated government policy that makes things happen. You have to work together. And that includes businesses thinking about, accessible websites and accessible services. It includes the public sector, as I said earlier, in terms of government digitizing services, making services as accessible as possible. I remember the government digital service had a slogan, "What is the user need?" Which is a very important kind of strapline. Because you're constantly thinking, how do I access this service? What is the easiest and smoothest way of doing it? And they even won a design award for their services. So that kind of thing makes a real difference. And obviously, we've talked about access to broadband in terms of its costs. So you can't do this, government cannot do this on its own, but nor can the other constituent parts do it without government. So there needs to be a forum where these ideas are discussed and worked through.
Absolutely. Fantastic. So the next one is looking at skills. So we're calling on the next government to ensure that all adults can get the vital help that they need with digital skills, confidence, and safety in an age of AI. So at Good Things Foundation, we see that AI literacy is now part of digital literacy. So there's no point in helping people to cross that digital divide with basic digital skills if we don't include AI, because it's here with us every day already. And we want also for digitally excluded people to be on that pathway to the opportunities in the future. As I said, there's 8.5 million adults lack the most basic digital skills. So we think that it's essential that community-based learning, that informal learning, is part of the action plan to ensure all adults can get help that they need. But also the essential digital skills entitlement, which I have been very much was a real fan of when that was brought in by the Conservative government. But now looking at the stats, less than 18,000 people a year are actually going through that program, which is a terribly terrible problem that we've got. And we need to have a review to see why the sector, why the formal DFE funding for adult skills is not getting through to that very basic digital skills levels. So there's some practical things with DFE around essential digital skills, but also a recognition of the power of that community-based in the National Digital Inclusion Network, in local community organisations, in libraries, where people are getting this help on a day-to-day basis in an informal and friendly and trusted way.
Yeah, I'm too long out of government now to know the details of what's happened with that program. I mean, there are lots of companies that claim to be providing digital skills to adults. Google, for example, comes out with lots of statistics in the millions of people who it says have taken its digital skills training, which I assume obviously is online. But again, going back to your first slide, this is a mix of government-funded programs, but also business-led programs. I said that I work with Common Sense Media on digital literacy in schools, but there's also a British organisation, Internet Matters, that is a combination of businesses that, in theory, provide support for families, parents, and children in terms of digital literacy and digital skills. So this is another example where I don't believe simply a government program can deliver. Because, as is intimated by what you said, Helen, that is subject to cuts or restricted funding. But it needs a formal partnership where government can use its power to convene companies who have these resources to ensure that as many adults as possible get access to programs like this.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting what you're saying about businesses like Google and others as well. Barclays, Lloyd's banking group, many of them do have good content, but actually there's no plan, there's no coherence, is that there's no idea of, I mean, there is an essential digital skills framework, but actually I don't think we need more content. I mean, we probably need more content on AI literacy. Good Things launched a basic video recently. But actually, it's how do we bring that together? How do we make that coherent? How do we make sure that people who need it are getting it? You're right. I think that Google has got some great content and many people are using it, but you've got to be online to be able to do it. So actually is how do we make sure that that content is the best of the content and the most relevant of the content is found by the people who need it. Our third one is about tech. So actually, Good Things Foundation, we went through a bit of a pivot. So it was a post-pandemic pivot. Before the pandemic, we were very much about that very basic digital skills and supporting people in communities. But by the end of March 2020, we realized that as the doors closed on those essential local community places and libraries, that people just didn't have the tech, they didn't have the devices, they didn't have that connectivity. And so we helped over 20,000 people during the pandemic, but that was with new devices. And we decided that we would do this pivot and that we would create the National Device Bank. So we want the next government to put all of their old tech, the appropriate old tech, we're very aware of security, up to for reuse for digital inclusion. And clearly we've got the National Device Bank, we've got that mechanism to get those devices out to the people who need it. And this is great for digital inclusion. It's great, as I said, for society and economy, but it's also really good for the planet. The UK is the second largest emitter of e-waste per capita in the world. I think that's basically because we also are early adopters of technology, so we go through technology, but we're saying that we want government to put their tech up for reuse, but also lead businesses by example. So that this can only be a good thing.
Yes, I don't know enough about the National Device Bank, so that's a very good thing for me to explore. But I mean, I keep referring to my comfortable middle class existence. My wife is very frugal, so she buys her phone and our kids' phones through secondhand sites, and I've been musing about that because there is a trust issue here. trust that you're going to get a device that works and is up to scratch, and also trust if you hand over your device to a recycler that your data is going to be safe. So there's an education element here. But you are right. It's something we don't really talk about enough. The fact that obviously you can make tech much more affordable or even free if you focus on recycling. You can benefit the planet, obviously, by getting much more use out of devices going forward. And I think it's a very important thing to flag because it's just never in the tech debate at all. So great.
Fantastic. And, there's far too many bits of tech going into landfill, and that could go into the hands of digitally excluded people. I just want to reassure everyone, though, we're definitely not saying that rubbish technology should be given to excluded and vulnerable people.
No. I mean, that's the point. People need to know that the tech is good. But I mean, I'll give you an example. My son's laptop blew up. It's now sitting, on the kitchen table, and I kind of don't know what to do with it because I'm nervous about just take it to the recycling dump because of the data. Nor do I have. There's no easy way for me to say, right, I'm going to send this to a recycling centre that specialises in taking laptops that have blown up and turning them back into something to be used by somebody in the future because it's not, it's only about 2 years old.
Yeah. Well, you'd be delighted to know I've got a solution for you, but I'll email you afterwards.
Brilliant.
Fourth ask is about that affordability of internet access. So the innovation, so everyone can afford to get online. We've already covered this. I think that this is about that innovation. So, we talked about the Jeremy Corbyn thing. It's like, is there an innovation where we could potentially say that everyone who is on universal credit, who can't afford broadband, gets free broadband for 6 months, for example. So there's policy innovation, but there's also potentially tech innovation as well. But that's fantastic. And we have something called the Data Poverty Lab, where we have researchers and experts looking at that innovation. So skipping forward to the fifth one is the signposting. So we've got 8.5 million people who don't have the skills. We've got 2.5 million people who can't afford it. But there is help. So the National Digital Inclusion Network can help people with basic digital skills support. They can help people to use public services. They can help people with free connectivity from the National Data Bank. So 500,000 SIMs we've got, Ed, from Virgin Media, O2, Vodafone and Three in that national data bank to give to people. And when we get devices donated to us, we then get those out for reuse through that network too. But people need to know about it. So people must be phoning government helplines and saying, I can't get online, I can't fill in this form. The NHS, we hear that all the time, that people can't get GP appointments because they're not online. So whenever people actually go to a government service, go to a job centre, ring up a government helpline, we're asking the next government to just signpost them to people, to those local community support, that local library within the National Digital Inclusion Network. So I think this is a really great way of getting the people, when they're presenting and saying they can't do it or they can't afford it, to the help that they can, that is already available to them nearby.
Well, I think it's a brilliant policy, and so should government, because it doesn't cost any money for a start, which is always an attractive policy to government. And again, I think it just in that one kind of policy, you highlight again a really important thing, which is, when you're talking about digital inclusion, you need to go to where people are. So you need to think through, what are the services that people who are digitally excluded using at the moment? Where are they most likely to encounter someone who could potentially help them, whether it's their local GP practice or the job centre or whatever. And if you ensure that those people who interact the most with the digitally excluded are trained to say, well, actually, here's a little card which will tell you exactly where to go in order to get access to these kind of services. That's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. So we don't have loads of time, but Ed, one question is that last one, you said they should love it because it's free. What holds them back? What holds politicians back from making these very practical, pragmatic policy decisions? Because it is free, but it will include work, right? So what holds them back from actually making these things happen?
It's a tough question. One is focus, obviously. I mean, the trouble is that in politics, ministers come and go. So that's one thing. Two is sexiness, if I can put it that way. I was thinking about another more appropriate word, but I couldn't. I'm thinking about, for example, Ofcom, the media regulator, in theory has a responsibility for media literacy, but it never really gets much prominence. So you've got to kind of have people who really care about it and are there for a long time to make sure it happens. And you've got to convene people. And you've got to, because again, some of the things we've talked about, signposting or whatever, don't cost any money. It's just a question, frankly, of banging on about it and kind of checking up, through the pyramid, the hierarchy or whatever, that it's cascaded down to the people who are actually working on the front line. This is something that they can do. And I think, what's been inspiring about this discussion is I think that, all the building blocks are there thanks to the work that you do and have done for so many years. It's a question of, how can I put it, housekeeping, in the sense of just thinking through how do you make sure that all these individual initiatives and interactions are put together into a coherent narrative so that government and the main organizations, whether it's the NHS or whatever, can grab it and make it happen. It's not a very coherent way of me putting that, but you know kind of what I mean.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that that's why when it comes to the end of the day, it's about leadership, it's about prioritization, it's about having a plan and bringing those people together, which is fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ed, for helping us this morning to launch our manifesto to fix the digital divide. I know incredibly busy day, and so we're
You've
very
been brilliant. You've been brilliant, Helen, and you've ended it right on time as well. I mean, you're amazing.
of course, the manifesto's online, and then we have next Thursday we have Fix the Digital Divide, Digital Futures for Good election special, where you can hear from community organisations. So that's next Thursday, the 27th of June, 1 till 2. So of course, look for Good Things Foundation on social media, and obviously Ed's got a great LinkedIn profile as well. He always has lots of interesting things on his LinkedIn, so please do look for us on social media, go to the Good Things Foundation website, look at our manifesto, and please everybody keep advocating for digital inclusion, because if we work together we really can fix the digital divide for good. Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you.
Take care.